Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Barbara Ruehling. I lead a little company called Book Sprints, based in New Zealand and Berlin. And we do rapid content production. It's a process called Book Sprints. It takes 5 days to create a book. And we do that by rethinking sort of the content production and publication workflows, and not just by writing faster, but by facilitating collaboration and creating a concurrency of the different tasks that are happening. Concurrency is the ability to perform multiple tasks by different people at the same time. And the way we do that is getting a group of experts together in a room for 5 days, a facilitator, and a technology, single source, very much building on what the panel discussed before. We actually also work with PageJS that Julie was presenting. And to give you just like a quick example of what that can look like, these are 2 books that we did with a German publishing house called Haufe. They usually work not in a concurrent workflow, but in a sequential workflow, which means one department hands it over to the next, to the next, to the next. And then they also do business consultancy, so they write their own books as well, and needed a product fast, but they also had very distributed knowledge within the company between the business consultants, between creatives, marketing people, editors. So they came to us, they brought all of these people that you see here, that's me, the curly head, in one room for 4 days. In this case, we made an exception, usually it's 5. And in those 4 days, they wrote a book. And then we did it again for the second book. They love pink. Those books are pink. After we did the first book sprint with Haufe, I did a presentation with the team lead. And this is the slide that Michael Borsig is his name, the Haufe team lead, made to describe what their workflow usually looks like. So a typical sequential workflow, going from the content strategist to the editing team, to the designers, to then experts to do fact-checking, going back to the designers for correction, going back to the editing team for correction, uploading, and then final approval by the content strategist. That's their plan. On the left side, the reality is much more messy, going back and forth, and they've been so frustrated with this process taking so long that they came to us to do a book sprint. So with Michael's permission, I'm using his slide to show what the workflow looks like. Another example I think that we all are familiar with is this kind of Mike's chapter 1, in brackets 2, latest, final, one last edit, copy edited. Use this, Thursday, 14 November 2019, final, def 2B. So this happens when we have not only a sequential workflow, but also often different file formats sending around Word docs, and then InDesign files, and then PDF, and so on. So what the single source is trying to solve, we try to solve in an even earlier step by bringing in the single source and all of the collaborators into one facilitated process from the very beginning of the content production. And then, yeah, we can make something like these books in, I don't know what just happened, in 4 days. So, yeah, what do we mean by collaboration and concurrency? What do we need for it? It's usually a group of around 6 to 12 experts, one facilitator who's trained in this book sprint method, and then we have a book sprint team of book designers and illustrators and copy editors that are very attuned to this 5-day process. They also are in different time zones. Our copy editors are mostly in New Zealand and South Africa, so they can do night shifts when the team of experts finishes a day of writing. They can do already like some light copy editing, send feedback back to the writers for the next day. The book designers and illustrators work in the single source technology. The one we're using is Ketida, which is developed by the Coco Foundation, and also using PageJS. So exactly what Julie was describing earlier. As the writers are writing the content, they can already see what it's going to look like. They can give feedback back to the book designers. They get a much better idea of what the outcome can be. And as soon as after the first day or so, there's a clear idea of what the book objective is this going to be a playbook for dummies, or is this going to be very academic, very serious looking, the book designers can start developing the design. And then we also have illustrators doing the diagrams, anything that's been scribbled on a napkin by the experts that can turn around very quickly. So all of this happens in the same 5 days. The process looks more or less like this. It has 4 phases, but as it is concurrent, all of these phases are iterative and overlapping, but more or less the facilitator guides the group first through conceptualizing the book. Of course, there's the goal that was set before the experts were invited, but then really narrowing down what exactly the scope is, what the different objectives are, structuring all the content, and then going into writing mode, drafting, often in small teams. So even then, we still like working collaboratively, maybe like 2 or 3 experts working together on one chapter. Then they start handing this over to the next little group of 2 or 3 people for editing and reviewing. And this happens about 3 or 4 times during those 5 days. So at the end of the sprint, almost everyone in the group has worked on almost everything. And there's a single reader journey, there's a cohesive narrative to the book. And as I mentioned, the book production team in different time zones works on the layout, on the copy editing, and the illustrations at the same time. So just by doing everything at the same time doesn't make it less messy. So at the center of this process is the facilitation process. So we don't just put people in a room and say, now do everything at once, but we have a facilitator really guiding this group through conversations, through the different work steps, creating a shared mental model of what they're working on, a lot of conversations, navigating power dynamics, especially when you have groups of experts coming together. It can be really helpful to have an outside facilitator to make sure that everyone can be as constructive and as productive as they can be, which is not always the case. We see a lot of teams that we work with, organizations where the existing hierarchies don't really foster collaboration. So having somebody coming in from the outside who is not part of that dynamic can be extremely helpful. The facilitator also does the task and time management, so people can really focus on what they're writing on at that moment. They don't have to think about the bigger picture. Someone is there taking care of the bigger picture, making sure that nothing falls off the table. All the goals that the group sets out in the beginning can be achieved within those 5 days. And the facilitator also coordinates with the book production team, with the copy editors and designers, to make sure all of this is done in time. This works especially well for topics that are quite interdisciplinary, where the knowledge is distributed, maybe distributed between practitioners and researchers, implicit practical knowledge, people who have experience of many, many years working in a field but have maybe never really voiced it or written it down, coming together with a group of peers can then bring out this knowledge in a lot of conversations, interviewing each other, reviewing each other, adding to each other's written drafts. So this is one example. I'm just going to show a few examples of a group called Precarity Lab, of a group of researchers working on precarious work conditions in the digital economy. So they have all been doing research over many years from very different angles: sociology, economy, technology, and then bringing all of this knowledge together in this 5-day process and creating a book that was later published by MIT Press and by Penguin, and doing some fun little group exercises along the way. That's one example. Another example is this anatomy textbook that we did with the University of Hawaii. This was a virtual book sprint. This has been happening over the last 2 years. We do quite a lot of OER textbooks. Sometimes these are new versions of existing textbooks of OER materials. Sometimes they're completely written from scratch. Often it's a kind of a hybrid between both. In this case, it was important to localize the knowledge for a Hawaiian context, mostly for nurses and practitioners in the medical field, breaking down some very complex textbook literature that is out there, but also localizing it and making it really relevant for their field. This was another book that was done in 8 days online. When we do virtual book sprints, we take a little bit longer, we cheat a bit, but then it's a little bit shorter days. And this was then published in Pressbooks. This is a book sprint I did with Hindawi a month ago. They have over years created very specific workflows of journal development, and the knowledge of how these workflows operate sit in different departments that don't necessarily know what the others are doing. There's sort of a handover process, but not kind of a general documentation of it. So they came together for 5 days to create this documentation, both for new colleagues, but also for their partners in the field and for anyone interested in journal development workflows, because they created kind of quite a unique model and a software to do this. This was kind of like a hybrid book sprint. You can see a few participants are there participating online. Something else that's now happening, I think, more and more, is that we have these kind of hybrid work processes. Some people were planned from the beginning to be working remotely. Others got COVID during those days and then dialed in from home. And in those 5 days, they created their handbook, which is both in a print version and then also as a book website. So again, both of this was done through the single source technology and this facilitated process in the 5 days. This is another example, another book that we did, showing you a little bit of what the design can look like, both on the cover and inside pages and illustrations. This was done with the University of California Digital Library. Apart from the title, Lighting the Fire, there were actually wildfires here in the region at the moment, and there was a blackout, so they had to work offline for part of the time. But they still managed to do it within the 5 days. I couldn't help but sneak in a photo of how this book was written. There's John on the piano, creative process. And our next step as book sprints is continuing to develop this 5-day sprint facilitation method, both for in-person and hybrid and virtual group settings. But we're also launching PubMaker now, which is a service to produce HTML-based print and web publications, like the one, for example, we saw for the Hindawi Journal Development Handbook, and helping teams to create their templates to work with Page.js, what Julie was presenting earlier, and getting their print and web publications out there. All of this is done again with HTML typesetting and works hand in hand with the book sprints process, but also separately from the book sprint. I was told to leave time for questions, so I still have 6 minutes left, so I don't know if there's any questions. I'm happy to answer.
Is PubMaker an alternative to Pressbooks?
No.
Sorry, repeat that.
Yeah. Is PubMaker an alternative to Pressbooks? No, it's a different service. It can it could be an alternative, but it can also be just creating Page.js templates to use in whatever workflow a publisher or an organization is working with. We work with quite a lot of organizations that are not publishers and are also not necessarily looking for getting their book published with a publishing house. So international organizations that create workshop materials, for example, the Hindawi handbook is not just an internal document, also external, but it's not looking for a publisher. I brought a few examples. This is the British Library created this one, and they would, for example, have a need for more documentation like this, and they could create their own Pages templates to do their own HTML book production workflow or book website workflow as well. This is another example. This was done in 3 days with the Coco Foundation. And then some do go to publishers. It really depends, like the one we had here in MIT Press, the Techno-Precarious. So PubMaker is basically a service bringing together book designers to work with Page.js and create the publications.
I'm just wondering, the 5 days versus 2 years. What do you feel you're revealing to the publishing community about the broader question of just how darn long it takes to do a book?
Yeah, I think the final December 24, Mike copy edited is an answer to that. So on the one hand, it takes a lot of people. It takes a village. We don't do a book sprint with 2 people. We also don't do a PhD sprint. If somebody comes to us, we do get these requests, but you still have to do your three-year research. That's not going to be done in 5 days. But after you have done your 3-year research and done your PhD, and you come together with some colleagues who have also done that, then there are ways to get extreme productivity and creativity and motivation and joy in these kind of facilitated processes that are very hard to maintain over the 2 years or 6 months or however long it might be, 20 years, where we don't have this kind of like focused energy, immediate feedback, and the immediate tangible results by seeing what we're doing. So having sort of all of the pieces of the puzzle in one room and be really focused on what they're doing. It's still a lot of hours if you add up sort of, the 10, 15 people working together for long days, over 5 days. That may not necessarily be so much less time than you would take over the 2 years. But it will save you a lot of time that just gets lost, when you get your corrections 2 months later and you have to get back into the mindset, what did I even mean by that 3 months ago? Having the immediate feedback, having also just a group of people who have very different skill sets that we can harness in the process. So if someone gets stuck somewhere, you can hand it over to somebody else. So yeah, I think it's a very different workflow, and it's looking at the group dynamics of the process more than just the expertise of each person in the process.
I'm curious to know what your revenue model is. How much the process costs, what the unit economics are.
The question is what our revenue model is. So we get hired by organizations, universities, companies to facilitate these processes. We have a very sliding scale of cost. We come from a background of open source software development, so we still have our heart in open source, and anything that's, a lot of the books are published with the Creative Commons license, so we will have a very different price point for a book in that region than for a more commercial project. But I think a lot of the times the organizations that hire us are not necessarily interested in selling the books. It's a lot of the times it's really about knowledge distribution. So for example, I mentioned international organizations that create workshop materials. That is already budgeted in their own budgets, and they just need ways to disseminate the knowledge and not just sell the book. software manuals, for example, that come out together with the software release. Again, it's not their interest to sell the manuals, their interest to sell the software. So they need a comprehensive manual that they can bring to all their trade shows, etc., and get their own customers on board. So yeah, we often now like budgeted into these cycles for software development or for new NGO phases or research phases.
Hi, I'm just curious about your facilitators. Who are they and where do you find them?
I'm one of them. It's a really good question. It's very hard to find. It's a very specific skill set. We say it differs a little bit from other kinds of facilitation where it is more about sort of making people enjoy a process. We also hope people enjoy the process, but we have a very clear outcome, so it's very production-oriented facilitation. So we need to find facilitators that can both listen well and mediate a group, mediate conflict and guide a group, but at the same time also really put their foot down and do everything it takes to get to that final product. So they come from a very different background. We haven't really found like the exact profile, but many come sort of from like the humanities or political activism, people-oriented fields.
Okay, thank you.